and it's in the breaking. We come unbound, and it's in the giving. We are found, yeah. You could barely change.
Welcome to A Medicinal Mind, Wisdom and Wellbeing, a podcast dedicated to the telling of authentic stories and the sharing of insightful wisdom, exploring science and spirituality, medicine and Mother Nature. No topic is off limits when it comes to growing our personal understanding and supporting our collective well-being. With your host, Dr. Rob Abbott, a family medicine resident practicing spiritually focused and evolutionarily informed functional medicine, we hope to nourish your being so that you can flourish in whatever the moment has called for you to do.
And I know you tried.
In episode 48 of A Medicinal Mind, Wisdom and Wellbeing, I welcome back the inquisitive mind of the researcher known affectionately as the Magnesium Man, Morley Robbins. In my two previous discussions with Morley, episodes 23 and 32, we explored the foundations of mineral metabolism, the intricate dance between iron, magnesium, and copper, and the overall implications of these minerals on our health. In this new foray into the world of biochemistry, Morley leads us through a fascinating exploration of his most recent research rabbit hole: the importance of fat-soluble vitamins, and most specifically vitamin A, and its part in the wider dance of mineral biochemistry. Morley begins the conversation with a foundational discussion of vitamin A. What really is this nutrient? What is retinol, retinal, or beta-carotene? Is the vitamin A in carrots the same vitamin A in beef liver? Exploring further questions, Morley helps to answer: what are some of the highest sources of retinol? What is the history of cod liver oil and the ingestion of organ meats? What really is retinol doing in the body? Besides the involvement in balancing oxidative stress, is it the molecule and not iron driving the production of hemoglobin and eventually the oxygen-carrying red blood cell? We then shift the discussion into the intricate science behind energy production in the mitochondria and the fascinatingly beautiful electron transport chain. Where does iron, oxygen, magnesium, vitamin A, lipids, and copper enter the scene in order for us to make the energy currency of the body, ATP? As the story unfolds, we begin to discover that vitamin A is behind perhaps the most important systemic processes in the entire body: energy production, genetic expression and regulation, inflammation, oxygen deliverability, and oxidative stress. Shifting back our discussion to that of fat-soluble vitamins, A, D, and K, Morley fills us up with the reality that vitamin D supplementation alone is likely not helping, and actually probably hurting more people than we think. And where does copper fit into the metabolism and function of the fat-soluble vitamins? And we start to ask the questions: what really is the difference between a vitamin and a mineral, chemically, structurally? How does their chemical structure affect their function and location of action in the body? We then end the discussion with an exploration of vitamin A and its importance in genetic expression and regulation. Why are people so terrified of vitamin A overdose or toxicity? I encourage you once more to listen to this conversation at least 2 or perhaps 3 times to really synthesize all of the ideas presented by Morley and myself. And be sure as well to explore the show notes for today's show on our podcast page or your podcast app or any other podcast media device to find our link to the intricately described nutritional testing resource, a jam-packed guide created by the visionary researcher Dr. Chris Masterjohn, to help you discover how to properly assess, test, and address functional nutritional status and any unearthed clinical deficiencies. And with that, let's dig into the show. Well, Morley, we are back again together after some time away. Both of us still doing a lot of work, but so grateful to have you back here for our third episode together. So thanks for joining the show again.
Absolutely. I'm happy to be here.
So I think, you really need no introduction, and we'll see what I actually put into the introduction of this show. And really excited to kind of get into some other topics. We've talked about a lot with mineral metabolism and a lot of the effects of iron, copper, magnesium in our previous shows. And today, gonna sort of weave in a different story that I certainly haven't really delved into a lot, and is fairly new, something you've introduced me to fairly recently. And hopefully will give people something else to chew on, which I think is probably one of your best gifts and talents. So would love for you to start by maybe kind of recapping how this all got started and lead us into our next discussion.
Absolutely. So as you know, I've been focusing a lot on three minerals: the magnesium, the bioavailable copper, and the iron. And I'm pretty strident in my position that this idea of anemia is a lie on this planet. This planet that has 36% iron as its greatest element on the planet Earth is iron. So it's not that the iron is missing, it's just not functional. But there's a lot of lazy shorthand that's used in literature and used in diagnosis. And a lot of practitioners say, well, you are anemic. And that's bothered me for a long time. And I've been chipping away at what's really going on, what are the markers to really understand that. And the one that surprised me, and I wasn't expecting, was the importance of retinol, which is the animal-based form of vitamin A. When people think of vitamin A, they think of carrots. They think of beta carotene. It's called carotene because of carrots. There's a reason why people think that.
Yeah.
But there's a big difference between beta carotene and retinol, because you need 12 molecules of beta carotene. You need energy, and you need a really important enzyme called beta-carotene monooxygenase, BCMO, I think it's called. And that enzyme is what converts beta-carotene into one molecule of retinol. Well, it turns out that beta-carotene monooxygenase requires bioavailable copper. Ding, ding, ding. So here we are again, back to this copper thing. And I was putting together some material when I was down in Australia, and was fascinated by the fact that there was a Dr. Block, he was an MD, in Europe towards the end of the First World War. We were talking like 1916, 1917, as the war was winding down. There were a lot of orphans that were a byproduct of the war, parents dying and kids were left. And what he realized is a lot of these kids had night blindness.
Yes.
And Dr. Block is the guy that figured out why they had night blindness. And it's because they had insufficient levels of retinol in their diet. And so he did two things. He gave them butter, grass-fed butter, and he gave them cod liver oil. Then suddenly they had their vision back. And he published 7 or 8 articles. I've got references to them. But I was really fascinated by that. And I wondered, what is it that retinol is doing? I mean, why is that able to stop night blindness? Well, it turns out that one of retinol's greatest gifts is it's a chain-breaking antioxidant. So, as you well know, and probably your listeners know, when you have lipid peroxidation, when the fats are getting rusty, it's a chain reaction because there's all these oxygens that have hydrogens attached to them. And once that initial breach takes place, it just starts to go right on down the line. But retinol stops that. Pretty cool. So one of the more significant things that retinol does is it stops hydrogen peroxide, which is what's involved in night blindness, because the retina are getting burned out by hydrogen peroxide. And that's why they can't see it right. And so you begin to say, wait a minute, this retinol thing, it's got a lot going for it. It's got to be pretty important. And then I happened upon some research by Dr. Hodges from 1978 that was studying the use of retinol to build hemoglobin, only to discover that the first recorded use of retinol to restore hemoglobin production was in 1855 by a Theophilus Thomson, who was a noted London physician, member of the Royal Society, which means he was not just your average Joe. And he was a fellow of the Royal Society. And he used cod liver oil to improve hemoglobin status. That's pretty impressive. And then what Hodges did, he developed a very sophisticated model where he denied people vitamin A over an extended period of time, almost a year, and he watched their hemoglobin methodically drop over that time period because he wanted to separate the impact of iron versus the impact of retinol. That was pretty interesting. And so what you see, and it's in that deck of slides that I sent you that you probably haven't had a chance to look at, but what you'll see is when he introduced iron, there was a spike, just a little spike, but there was a spike for about 20 days, and then it went back down. And you may or may not know this, but back in the early 1900s, they were using arsenic, which is a heavy metal, but they were using arsenic to force the synthesis of red blood cells. And it works really well for a little bit of period, for a short time, but we know well enough now that we shouldn't be using arsenic to do that. So you've heard the expression, my doctor said butter was bad for me, so he gave me margarine. Like we're supposed to feel better for that. So my doctor said arsenic is bad for me, so he gave me iron. That's the same thing. And so iron is another heavy metal. And iron will force red blood cell production, which is a good thing, short term, but it's a very bad thing, long term. So then what Dr. Hodges did was he introduced retinol, and the hemoglobin started to take off at a 45-degree angle, like a rocket. And it's a very important study, but it's from 1978, so who would trust that? That's old news, right? But what's in that article is some very extensive studies that prove how thoroughly this relationship between retinol and hemoglobin synthesis is. And what I'm basically concluding is that I'm not quite sure where this iron thing got started. I have some theories. And I think it started with Warburg and Krebs in their lab in Berlin in 1927. But I don't want to pin the tail on that donkey entirely. But a lot of confusion about iron and hemoglobin, when in fact, the real active ingredient that's essential for building hemoglobin is retinol. And your first instinct is to say, well, what's retinol doing? I mean, why? Well, we know it's a very important antioxidant. We know it's a very nutrient-dense food. again, just because of its fat properties. Actually, retinol has 4 different metabolites. There's retinol, OL, there's retinol, AL, there's retinoic acid, and that comes in 2 forms. There's 13 cis and all trans. And then there's retinil with a Y, retinil acetate. Those are the different metabolites that are all possible from retinol. And they have incredible frequency as a substance, which is very important because people don't realize that we are light and sound beings and that we vibrate, that's why we are so special. And the energy that we produce allows our cells to vibrate. The cells touching are constantly touching, constantly vibrating to see, hey, you okay? I'm okay. Well, how are you feeling? And so this has happened, for 100 trillion cells. It's a big deal. So then you find out, well, why is it so important that retinol be there? Well, it turns out that hydrogen peroxide will kill hemoglobin production. I mean, it really destroys the ability of the blood to maintain the proper oxidation state for hemoglobin. It goes from oxyhemoglobin to methemoglobin, and it gets oxidized. It gets tweaked. Well, hydrogen peroxide is one of the principal causes of that, and it turns out that catalase, a very important antioxidant enzyme, is very instrumental, and there's some very important research that was done by Dr. Schultz and Dr. Miller. Schultz was in 42, 43. Miller was in 56. But they were showing that catalase was instrumental in helping to produce hemoglobin. And the reason why is because it was stemming the tide of hydrogen peroxide. And then you start to dig into this retinol thing, and you find out that, retinol activates haptoglobin, which is a very important enzyme, as you probably know. And what does haptoglobin do? It protects hemoglobin from hydrogen peroxide. So you have haptoglobin protecting hemoglobin, and you have hemopexin protecting heme. And retinol is really important for those functions. Again, because of its properties to neutralize hydrogen peroxide. So we're beginning to get a sense of, wow, this retinol thing is pretty important. Then I came across some research from 1987. The researchers were Barber and Cousins. They were noted copper and iron researchers at the University of Florida in Gainesville back in the day. And this particular study was looking at the role of retinol to load copper into the protein ceruloplasmin so that it could express as the enzyme ferroxidase. So then we're like, oh, wow, now things are beginning to get really interesting. Well, then when you realize that copper is a fat-soluble mineral, so it's got a real partnership and tag team with retinol. So retinol and copper play powerful roles in the body, and the ability to have ferroxidase enzyme function is really important. So what is ferroxidase? Well, in a generic sense, it's a multi-copper oxidase. You're like, what? Multi-copper? So a classic example would be ferroxidase has, when it was originally discovered, it had 8 copper atoms. 4 were cuprous and 4 were cupric, surrounding an oxygen molecule. It's not an enzyme, it's a nuclear reactor to regulate iron. But another noted multi-copper oxidase is cytochrome C oxidase, and that's what runs complex 4. As you and I were discussing just before we got started, that particular enzyme has 14 subunits. A lot of the literature will say 13, but they just discovered a 14th component. Well, the first three, 1, 2, 3, are copper dependent, and they are driven by the mitochondrial genes. The other 11 are driven by nuclear genes. But what is multi-copper oxidase doing? It's allowing us to live on planet Earth. It's that important because we live on a planet that has oxygen. Now, Earth did not always have oxygen. There are astronomers and astrophysicists and astrobiologists who are convinced that there was a time when Earth had no oxygen, and oxygen didn't start to appear on the planet until a couple of billion years ago. I've read it could have been as long as 2.5 billion years ago. You know, we're quibbling over 500 million years. But,
Only 500 million.
Oh yeah, right. But the point is that cyanobacteria started giving off oxygen, and when it started to build up, 99% of the life forms on the planet died. Because what were the life forms living on? Iron. And iron and oxygen are really toxic together. So suddenly the planet was faced with a crisis. You had to figure out a way, what are we going to do with all this oxygen? Enter, from the stage right, copper. And a wonderful article that your listeners might want to read is by Robert Crichton and Roger Paris from 2001. And it's called Old Iron, Young Copper, Mars versus Venus. It's fascinating. And iron is connected to Mars and copper is connected to Venus. For the more hip set, you may know of John Gray. Men are from Mars, women are from Venus. Same theme, but not as enlightening from a chemical or mineral standpoint. But in any event, so we need this copper in order to activate the oxygen. What the heck does that mean? Well, listeners probably know that the oxygen is actually two atoms of oxygen that are kind of tied together by their electron bond. And there's
O2.
O2, exactly. O2. And so it's a pretty tight bond there. Well, the cytochrome C oxidase actually has 3 jobs that it's got to do.
We got to split water.
Yeah, we got to pull these oxygens apart and stretch the bond. That's step 1. Then we've got to allow 4 electrons that we get from 4 different cytochrome Cs to flow through the enzyme. And what a lot of the literature will tell you is, it's bouncing off the heme A and heme A3, and that's not true. An article in 2017 shattered that. And it turns out that the reason why Mother Nature uses copper is because copper is 3 times faster than iron. And it turns out that copper is 30 times faster than zinc. So copper is a big deal in this transaction. And there's a copper center A and a copper center B. And I believe there are 3 copper atoms in that complex. There may be more, but those are 3 that are typically identified. And the 4 electrons flow through that enzyme and get to the oxygens to make 2 molecules of water. But then, and that's step 2, and then there's step 3. Then the cytochrome C oxidase is also pumping 4 hydrogens into the outer section of the mitochondria to go over to complex 5 to run ATP synthase. And that is a rotor, it's basically an engine, that's spinning at 9,000 revolutions per minute. The car you drive redlines at 6,000 revolutions per minute. And so that's where the magnesium gets attached to the ATP so that the body can see it and use it. And part of the reason why people get fibromyalgia or get chronic fatigue is that they don't have enough copper to make the ADP to go over to complex 5. And there are 3 ADP that are produced in that transaction with the oxygen. And they don't know that they need magnesium in order to add that last phosphate so that the invisibility cloak leaves the energy molecule so the body knows that it's got energy. That's where the breakdown is. If you don't have bioavailable copper, if you don't have magnesium, you're not going to make energy. You're certainly not going to make it at the rate that you're supposed to make it. And so then we're realizing that this process is pretty important. Well, inside the mitochondria, you've got complex 1, complex 3, and complex 4. So you've got 3 major complexes sitting on cardiolipin, which is a fat. And if that fat gets rusty, the whole thing shuts down because the cytochrome C oxidase leaves the inner membrane of the mitochondria and goes to the outer membrane of the mitochondria with a flag, and it says, time to take us offline.
And it's apoptosis time. Yeah.
And it's apoptosis time. And there's a relationship between retinol and cardiolipin. Wow, who knew? So what we're dealing with here is the very formation of blood requires retinol. The very formation of energy requires copper and some fat. And we're beginning to, then you find out that when you have retinol deficiency, in fact, you were the one that really tipped me off about this, was that you have all sorts of gene expression problems, that they start to mutate more. Then I come to find out that retinol is really important for nuclear factor kappa B. It's not a bad guy. It plays good roles and bad roles. And if retinol is not present, tumor necrosis factor alpha takes over, and then you do have problems. And I was reading a fascinating article this morning about studying the retinol saturation of cervical tissue in a woman's cervix. I probably don't have that right. The cervix tissue. And when it was low, tumor necrosis factor alpha was high, and they were getting cancer of the cervix because retinol was low. And what was it allowing the HPV to do? Go wild. Why was HPV allowed to go wild? Because the energy production in that tissue wasn't able to optimize so that the tissues down there weren't vibrating fast enough, and the HPV took over. Rob, I got news for you. Rife was right. Everything is vibration.
Yeah.
And here's where it gets really it's more than just a little uncomfortable. When were you born?
Man, I am of a child of the 90s, technically. I was born in 1990.
1990, all right. Okay. So I was born in 1952, 3 years before President Eisenhower had his first heart attack. Now, Eisenhower had 8 heart attacks. Did you know that?
I knew he had a few.
Yeah, it was the 8th one that took him. But it was after his first heart attack that this guy named Ancel Keys put America on a low-fat diet. And he spooked everybody about cholesterol. And we lived under that absurd, fallacious belief for 60 years. In fact, it wasn't until 2016 that David Diamond and a team of researchers published an article in the American Journal of Clinical Nutrition, basically putting to rest the cholesterol theory of heart disease. Now, what's fascinating is that as Dr. Keys was aging, when he was in his late 80s and then his mid-90s, he wrote an article to the New York Times and then subsequently to the New England Journal of Medicine. Those are publications that people would say, those are highbrow. And basically what he said in those publications was that cholesterol in the diet has no relationship to cholesterol in the blood. And then he goes on to say something else. And we've known that all along. Did you know that? I didn't know that. He actually said that. Apparently, as you get closer to your deathbed, you decide you want to tell the truth more intently. And so the whole diet cholesterol theory of heart disease is bullshit. And it has been. And what I've come to realize is that the whole reason behind that fat-free, low-fat diet was to get retinol out of our diet. Because when you go into the 1930s, they were studying the level of retinol to the level of storage D. Did you know that?
I did not.
And retinol should be around 200 units, and storage D should be 20 units. It's a 10-to-1 ratio. It's very similar to the ratio of A to D in naturally prepared cod liver oil.
And animal foods.
Almost like Mother Nature knows what she's doing. So you need 10 parts retinol and 1 part D to get the right frequency. So I've changed the full Monty iron panel now to measure serum retinol and serum calcidiol, or 25-hydroxy, or storage D, whatever people know it as.
Correct.
And so one of my students, one of my graduates, just had her retinol tested, and she's very bummed out. She was one of those people that believed her doctor when the doctor said, your vitamin D is too low and you need to take high doses. So she took high doses, like 10,000 units a day. Not knowing that Dr. Ferris at Yale Medical School wrote an article in 1962 telling his professional colleagues very clearly that supplemental D causes renal potassium wasting. That's a good thing to know, right? And so she took 10,000 units of vitamin D, crashed her potassium, and then she found the MAG group after she had done this for 3 years. What does high dose D do to retinol, Rob?
It's a good question. I feel like we're going to disturb that ratio, and
Let's be a little harsher.
yeah,
Vitamin D kills retinol in the body, and it kills retinol in the eyes and the liver. Let's be really blunt about it. And so she did this vitamin A blood test, and her vitamin A is at 43, and the scale now in a post-1984 contemporary world of insanity is 38 to 98 is considered the range. They don't even go up to 200. And her storage D is 33. So she's got 43 and 33. She burst into tears because she realized that she has a lot of work to do to try to restore that ratio. And then you begin to think about the fact that, well, let's see, this retinol thing it's loading copper, so we have ferrooxidase. It's keeping hydrogen peroxide at bay. It's making sure that genes are working right. It's making sure that, I've got 20 articles now about retinol deficiency, looking at different factors, Rob. Heart disease, neurodegeneration, genetic defects, PCOS. You've heard of PCOS, right?
correct. Yeah.
Retinol deficiency causes PCOS.
It's interesting. It's interesting you said that. Maybe this is where I'll jump in.
Yeah, please do.
That was, I think, that last statement. If people, everything you've just said has been, incredibly enlightening, and the way you're telling the story is actually quite remarkable because it is so complex. But what you just described at the end, some of the things in which vitamin A, copper, and magnesium play critical roles. We're talking about, as you said, energy production, the production, and propagation of oxygen to those cells to even make energy in the first place. Gene regulation, which I want to hit on here a little bit. These are some core fundamental processes that these vitamins and minerals are regulating. And so if their ratios or if their amounts are off, you are compromising basically, I don't care what system you get into, you've basically compromised the body. And we talked a little bit before the show of, this concept of the wonderful train right in time for the podcast. We talked about this, idea of triage theory that's been well espoused and researched of, when you get into these deficiency states, or not necessarily deficiency states, but disturbed ratios, the body is having to sort of, basically figure out, well, where am I going to use this ATP, or this, I don't have enough magnesium, how am I going to use it? And sort of selecting certain processes. And this is happening at a cellular level and also on a sort of more macro system level. And
ratios are really important for minerals too.
Yeah.
And I'm sure they're very important for the vitamin complexes. And I'm sure they're, the enzyme ratios, and there must be a whole strata of ratios that we don't even know about, as you're suggesting with the triage theory. I mean, it's profoundly important. And the thing is, people think, well, where do I get retinol? Well, you get it from grass-fed eggs. You get it from grass-fed butter. You get it from grass-fed liver or organ meats, but especially the liver. You get it from high-fat dairy products, not low-fat, high-fat, full-fat. But people are terrified of fat. I was talking to a client yesterday who weighs 118, and she still eats a low-fat diet. I said, have you ever gained weight in your lifetime? She goes, no. But it never occurs to her to go full fat. And then, of course, we have cod liver oil. These are foods that have been methodically drummed out of our diet, Rob. People don't, when you go to the supermarket and you go to look for spread, you'll see 99 different versions of margarine and one option for butter.
Yeah.
Right? You don't buy cod liver oil at the store. You have to buy it from manufacturers who know how to process it properly. You don't go get Swanson's or Carlson's. That's manufactured. That's synthetic stuff. You don't go just get some liver. It's got to be grass-fed liver that's allowed to eat grass, where the farmer is really putting meticulous attention, like Joel Shalaton in Virginia, because he's a grass farmer. That's what he is. He says, I'm a grass farmer. I created a salad for my animals. He's very proud of it, and he should be. And I've made a pilgrimage to his farm just to thank him for what he does.
Well, if you do that, then you'll have to come and say hi to me, because I'm just down the road.
I will do that next time I'm in that area. But people don't understand how important grass is.
Yeah.
They don't understand what omega-3 means. They really don't get it. And they don't understand that the grass is pulling up minerals from the soil. And again, if the soil doesn't have it, then the vegetation doesn't have it, then the animals don't get it. So I had an opportunity I was at a conference up in Chicago recently, and I had an opportunity to have breakfast with Stephanie Seneff, who I'm sure you know.
Yeah, glyphosate researcher, amidst other things.
Amazing individual, so just incredibly full of information. But we were talking about glyphosate. You can imagine the conversation. Well, it turns out that glyphosate is basically glycine with an appendage.
Correct.
Right? Well, the body doesn't know. The body's just grabbing glycine.
It takes it up and it realizes it's not really glycine.
Right. Well, it turns out that there are 16 conserved glycine in ceruloplasmin. So ceruloplasmin has 1,046 amino acids. It's a monster. There are not many enzymes or proteins that are even that big. I don't know that there's a protein that's even bigger than that. But the fact of the matter is there's 16 conserved. And I asked her, I said, what does conserved mean? She said, well, it means it's really important.
Yep.
It means it's been protected evolutionarily for millennia of millennia. I said, okay, that's important. And then she said, there's something else you need to know, Morley. I said, I was bracing myself, looking for my seatbelt. And I said, what's that? And she said, glyphosate was created as an antibiotic. I said, I know that. She said, well, that means it chelates minerals. She said, glyphosate can chelate copper down to the pH of 1, which is below stomach acid.
Wow.
And so we know that glyphosate destroys the mineral status of the soil because that's why it destroys these weeds, allegedly. Wink, wink. It's supposed to be killing the weeds, right? Wink, wink. You get that? Right? It's getting the weeds, right? Well, let's talk about the fact that glyphosate is sprayed on wheat 4 times before it gets harvested. And then they spray it again as a desiccating agent to dry it out. Isn't that thoughtful? And so then we're being exposed to this toxic antibiotic poison that is sucking copper out of our body because that's what it does. That's what it's been designed to do. And so there's a really interesting video that you may have heard of it. It's called The Magic Pill, and it was produced by Pete Evans, who's a nutritionist down in Australia.
Yeah, I've seen that.
Okay. Well, I think the best part of the film is when the doctor, I want to say he's from India or somewhere, he plays a very, very powerful question. And he says, doctors don't ask the most important question. What are you eating? It's the most important question we've got to start asking people, because if they're eating their food from a supermarket or from a box with a drive-through window or some restaurant, they're getting GMO. They're getting glyphosate at levels that we can't even comprehend. And people need to start frequenting the farmers markets and start scrutinizing the farmers to make sure that they're getting clean food. We're being poisoned. And I've got a slide, again, it's in that deck, that compares the impact and the growth of the use of glyphosate across the United States from 1992 to 2012, I think it is, or 2014, something like that. So it's a 20-year period. And it's horrible. And then there's a slide right after that that shows where the copper's left in the country. Well, wherever there's not glyphosate, there's copper, is basically what the slide is. People have no idea. And if people realized how central this fat soluble mineral was and how dependent it was on retinol to make our bodies work the way Mother Nature intended, they'd be running down the streets like their hair was on fire.
Ever since I met Morley, I've been amazed by his youthful exuberance and passion for getting deep into the research. His ability to synthesize the literature, reach insightful conclusions, and then communicate it in an accessible manner is beyond that of nearly anyone else I have met to date. As this conversation unfolded, I was continually left pondering, what else is there to explore? What else is out there for us to uncover to help us restore our health? What of the many things that we are doing now in medicine do we need to most rapidly and desperately forget? While Morley answers many questions in this conversation, his greatest talent is perhaps not one of reaching new conclusions, but of asking the questions no one else can even think of asking in the first place. It's quite an amazing symphony, this entire story, as it just continues to unfold. And I hope people appreciate just the real-time nature in which, our conversations and, your research and the directions you've pushed me as we're sort of beginning to uncover this, but also the reality that we're looking back at research that has been done 80, 90, 100 years ago and sort of compiling and starting to synthesize, these ideas, and then seeing what interventions or things that we've done in the modern age that have kind of compromised it, and getting truly at these root causes. It is quite an amazing symphony. I know I don't want to get people too sidetracked, but you had asked me before the show, you're like, let's see if I can find your most interesting paper or resources on vitamin A. And so, of course, like always, like I did with iron, I was like, well, let's go back and what did I learn in medical school? So people are probably interested. What is taught in medical school? And I had actually one of the he was actually one of my good friends, the professor who taught this particular lecture, but went back and found a seem put, relatively kind of innocuous PowerPoints, 17 slides about sort of vitamin A synthesis and its function, and a lot of it focused on the idea that vitamin A, as you had mentioned, is not just one entity. And I think stepping back, it's easy to get confused when we talk about vitamins and minerals. The same thing we couple fruits and vegetables together. I joke like they're not the same thing. But we say vitamins and minerals. Well, vitamins and minerals are not the same thing. Magnesium, copper. These are these are elements with certain amounts of protons, neutrons, electrons. But these are elements, and vitamins are compounds, multi-atom elemental compounds, carbon, hydrogen, oxygen, very big compounds. And so the scale and size of things, while they might kind of perform and end up performing somewhat similar functions, catalytic or structural, they're very different, different entities. And this vitamin A in particular, as you mentioned, has many different structures. And as a molecule, the main modifying component is this long side chain, which we recognize as we're saying fat soluble. Fats have these long carbohydrates, sort of lots of carbon and hydrogen side chains, and then at the very end is that modification. This this changing something in chemistry terms, and this is how I think because this is my background, is changing it from an aldehyde, which is that retinal, or an retinol, which is an alcohol, or turning it into a ester, which is the form we store it in the liver, or carboxylic acid, which is retinoic acid. It's all sort of, it seems a little complicated. It's sort of the language of chemistry, but it's that modification. And each of those entities performs very different functions and may be stored in some form in very different ways. So you mentioned, vision, so that the aldehyde is really the component that has all the function in the eyes, while the carboxylic acid, the retinoic acid component, is the main one involved in gene expression. So people have probably heard of, and I sent you over the information about the retinoic acid receptor. And there's been tons of research into these different retinoic acid receptors. And they are essentially, not to generalize it too much, what's called a transcription factor, which is essentially an element that sort of turns on or is responsible for some form of gene production. That's why we call it sort of transcription, is the transcription of that gene. And so this is a regulatory gene element. And there's different aspects of how that retinoic acid, that component, this sort of form of vitamin A, interacts with different receptor subtypes. And what's so fascinating is the slide I'm looking at right now. You had mentioned NF-kappa B is sitting here right in front of me. This slide from my med school basically showing that A bound, you have retinoic acid dimerized and bound to that receptor, basically inhibits this NF-kappa B pathway. So we sort of, generally saying it's sort of an anti-inflammatory, but there it is sitting in front of me, this sort of random innocuous slide, which I'm sure no one really paid attention to, but I'm sitting here like, holy monkeys. And then you start looking at the literature, as we've kind of been doing recently, but the layers of genetic expression that are regulated by this, and people are probably most familiar with the idea around pregnancy of being super terrified of don't eat too much vitamin A because it's a teratogen, which is true. It's been studied, in isolation when you get to these ridiculous doses. And the reason it does it is it's basically messing with this gene expression that can cause limb defects. And some of probably the most common drug that people know about that it's related to is Accutane, which really kind of is like a synthetic, it's vitamin A toxicity. You're just basically, bombarding. It's poison. One of the poisons that I had a great pleasure of taking, but it's one of the things that people have to be on two forms of contraception if they're going to take that medicine, because the known teratogenic effects, which is basically this whole pathway of messing with gene expression, those effects. But the implications of that, and going back to, as we've already mentioned, all the other sort of pathways that we've gone down when we look at vitamin A, when we look at copper, and when we look at magnesium. I mean, these are huge fundamental core processes of any living organism. And I've been just really appreciative of you kind of helping to bring the story together, and then also starting to interweave, once again, where does vitamin D play play a role, and the idea that all of this is synergistic, and if we can come back to Mother Nature, whether it's bee pollen, whether it's liver, cod liver oil, we can come back and look at the ratios of things. Look what other cultures did. What did they eat? It's relatively simple. Yeah.
Yeah, what the thing that people don't know, back to your insights about the gene expression, EDR, vitamin D receptor, which everyone's so hepped up about, they're so excited. It doesn't work without RXR, which is the
RXR.
RXR is a retinoid receptor. It doesn't work without RXR. It does not work. And so what is taking a soy-based supplement doing to the status of retinol in the body? Well, we know from this one person that did testing, she's got a decimated vitamin A status in her serum.
Yeah.
43. That's insane. 43. It should be 200.
Yeah. And even that, and coming back to sorry to interrupt real briefly, in what you mentioned in terms of blood and tissue, we've made that theme, I think we focused on that quite a bit, is depending on what you want to measure in the body, and I want you to hit on, the reason I want to interrupt, I want you to hit on, how vitamin A is transported and where it's technically stored. People have probably heard of, well, why are we eating liver? What are we really measuring when we measure a vitamin A level, or as you mentioned, the storage form of vitamin D, and these ratios? They are all some degree surrogates, but vitamin A in this ester form primarily is stored in the liver. But in order to get anywhere, it has to be transported, and it gets modified, as we've already mentioned. So would love for you to maybe mention that sort of that dance and why that's important in its relation to previously mentioned vitamin D.
Well, I think it comes back to the role of protecting hemoglobin. I don't think people realize that the way I characterize it is the average adult has, what is it, like 5 or 6 liters of blood?
It's like 5 liters, yeah, 5 or 6 liters.
Yeah. And so I got to thinking, I wonder how many red blood cells that is. Well, someone's actually done that. It's 34 sextillion cells. Like, wow, that's a lot. That's 34 with 21 zeros. And then I thought, well, I wonder what the surface area is for 34 sextillion red blood cells. Someone had actually calculated that, Rob. And it's 9/10 of an acre. We don't think about the fact that we're carrying 9/10 of an acre of blood surface area in our body.
Yeah.
And so if it's generating more hydrogen peroxide, and guess what causes an increase in hydrogen peroxide? Vitamin D. Vitamin D supplements cause an increase of hydrogen peroxide. Isn't that interesting? Wow. And then that causes people whose hemoglobin to go low. Then they go to the doctor. The doctor doesn't know how to interpret a blood test to save their soul. And they don't know that, well, the hemoglobin is low because they're taking vitamin D supplements. And actually what they really need is retinol. But retinol is it's not very vogue. It's not very cool to say, well, let's take some cod liver oil. No, let's give you some iron. And then what does iron do? It causes the macrophages to get so chock full of iron that then the person gets autoimmune conditions. And that's the insanity of the system today, in a nutshell.
Yeah.
And I've got hundreds of clients who've gone down that bunny trail with doctors. I'm not making this stuff up. That's how it started.
It's interesting.
The doctor misinterpreted the vitamin D blood test because they didn't know that it was a magnesium-dependent enzyme that activates the storage and the active. They didn't know that. They didn't know they should be measuring magnesium first. And so they are numbers-driven, rule-driven, and it said low vitamin D must take vitamin D. So they told the person, 1,000, 2,000, 5,000, 10,000, 25,000, 50,000. The course record is a guy in Buenos Aires whose doctor told him to take 250,000 units of vitamin D, but the doctor didn't understand why he didn't respond well to that. Almost killed him. And so, again, we're managing to numbers, not managing to how does the body really work? What's the communication? Your triage theory is beautiful because it's based on ratios, and based on signaling, and based on balance. And that's how the body works. It's all about homeostasis, not numbers. What's the yin yang of what's going on? You know, what's the bob and the weave? And if you're just focusing on numbers, you lose sight of all that. And it's frightening because I think the practitioners of all faiths, I'm not picking on allopaths, I gave a presentation to 150 naturopaths who were prescribing 10,000 units of D in Arizona. I said, "What? You guys, are you crazy?" I said, "There's 500 days of sunshine a year in Arizona. What are you doing prescribing vitamin D?"
Yeah.
Because they were managing to a number and they didn't know that it was magnesium that was deficient. And all you've got to do is read Yang in 2014 and you find out that low vitamin D means that the person's got inflammation.
Yeah.
That's what low vitamin D means.
Yeah.
And you don't solve inflammation with vitamin D. In fact, you're going to make it 10 times worse.
Yeah. It's basically, I see it and time and time again, I'm often not having, when I see people the first time, I'm like, I already know the degree of, inflammation, illness that the person has. I can already predict what their vitamin D level is going to be. But that to me doesn't indicate or tell me how much time they're spending in the sun. Doesn't tell me how much they're taking. It tells me how much their body's utilizing. And that's what you just said. The body is in a state where it needs to utilize it. So if you're, it's basically, using it to the degree that it needs to control or trying to control the inflammation. So if you just give the person more vitamin D, you're just increasing the body's capacity to further propagate that. And people, I've just started to sort of learn more about, looking at the ratio, getting back to our sort of ratios and communication of 125 to 25 to 125. And there's some theories out there that some bacteria are basically blocking the vitamin D receptor as a way to evade the immune system. And you,
why would the pathogens do that? Because there's no vitamin A to change the frequency of the genes.
Yeah.
And I would argue that retinol and its various metabolites are a much more sensitive marker for inflammation than vitamin D. I think vitamin D is a downstream metabolite.
It's downstream. It's been utilized. It's yeah.
Yeah. And so if someone's got a retinol of 43, and it should be 200, right away he's like, wow, we got a serious problem on our hands. But if you don't know that retinol stops hydrogen peroxide in its tracks because it's chain breaker, then you don't know that the retinol is important. Or if you don't know that Wegelicki and Phillips in 1992 discovered that the mineral step, the cellular mineral step that precedes the production of substance P, and what does P stand for? Production. P is where all the cytokines get produced. Well, magnesium deficiency precedes substance P. And there's a certain point, to your point about triage, there's got to be a certain balance between calcium and magnesium. And when that ratio gets breached, and the magnesium is too low and calcium is too high, it sends off an alarm inside the cell and says, we've got an inflammatory state. What is inflammation? The cytokines make hydrogen peroxide. Did you know that? All the cytokines make hydrogen peroxide?
It's a great way to kill bacteria.
Well, yeah, it's a defense mechanism.
Yeah.
Then what happened to the energy production of the cell?
Yeah.
It just died because you can't make energy from H2O2. There's no way to work with it then, unless you have catalase or glutathione peroxidase. And again, people got to stop thinking that glutathione is something that they can pop like a pill, because glutathione requires a battery, and the battery is glutathione peroxidase, which is copper dependent.
It's back to that relationship. It's cycling. What you don't have is what you don't have is a glutathione deficiency. It's just all in the wrong redox state.
Exactly. Right.
Yeah.
But how many of your colleagues think like you do?
It's I wouldn't say very many.
So you're sort of an odd duck, right?
A little odd.
No, I'm saying that because I have great reverence for you and I admire what you're doing to try to really understand this. But you're a freak show compared to your peers. And there are probably 1,000 people not like you to one guy like you. And the 999 are popping vitamin D and calcium and zinc and iron like there's no tomorrow, because that's what the rules say to do. And
Yeah.
that's got to stop.
Yeah. We're going to get to a point, hopefully, and it's, slowly emerging. I know one of my good friends, Chris Masterjohn, if they do not follow his work, please start following and he recently made a ultimate testing guide for these nutrients based on what we have currently from blood testing, recognizing, as I've mentioned before and will continue mentioning, we are limited in what we're, for research purposes or clinical purposes, how we test tissue or how we, test blood, but where we currently are with the current level of evidence for being able to determine nutritional status from certain testing and potentially implications from some of the early studies of genetics that possibly some SNPs having a role in this, and it's a great document for only $30. I tell that you can use as a practitioner or a layperson to start to it's built for you to just start to build awareness, and I've been really appreciative of you trying to create and modify your blood chemistry profile and these profiles, because the reality is we're looking at surrogates and it's early on. One day hopefully we'll be able to get to a point where we'll have clear-cut ratios, we'll have expression patterns, we'll be able to look at tissue, we'll be able to look truly at the function of these, because in all honesty, an isolated magnesium level has very little value. I mean, it has some intrinsic value, but I need the concert. I need the symphony. Like you said with the vitamin A and vitamin D, if you just know someone's vitamin D level and it's 35, oh yeah, that's good. That's in the normal range. You're all healthy. If you don't know what their vitamin A is, or if they're not eating any fat, suddenly the story completely changes. And so it's hard to put all this into a concrete package that you'll be able to see cerebrally in these patterns. So hopefully one day we'll be able to really develop and integrate these tests in a way so we can think about it and make it at least a little bit easier to understand. And in the meantime, we might as well stick to, food-based sources and use those simple techniques and look back from an anthropologic perspective to inform what we should be doing while we kind of figure out how we got messed up and what we can do to determine what we really need to do to intervene to change it back to a healthy state.
Yeah. Well, I'll tell you what, I'm thrilled that you know Chris Masterjohn. I think he's a brilliant guy. And what I'd like you to do is put on your thinking cap about how we can create a three-way. And what I really would like to do is have an A debate.
Yeah.
And really dig into it, because I think and I'm sure Chris probably feels the same way about me, but I think for all of his talents, I still don't think he quite has it right.
None of us do. We can't.
No,
not even.
I don't think he understands the minerals the way he needs to, and I probably don't understand the fats the way he does.
Yeah.
So I think we really, and it would be so exciting to have the three of us get into a really healthy discussion about what do we know, what do we have to be careful of, what are the priorities, and I'm all about hierarchy of trying to refine this down to a simple set.
Yeah.
There are 84 minerals in seawater. There are 18 essential minerals, but there are only 3 that I focus on, Rob.
Yeah.
With those 3, I can run circles around most people who worry about the 18.
Yeah.
And so we have to be really thoughtful about what are the priorities here. And if, as you just mentioned, if someone doesn't have fat in their diet, that's a serious breach of their health. And they don't realize why. And if they don't have minerals in their diet, or if they don't have vitamin complexes, if they don't understand the difference between whole food vitamin C and ascorbic acid, or if they don't understand the difference between coal tar derivatives driven B vitamins and bee pollen, or beef liver that delivers B vitamins, or if they don't understand the difference between retinol palmitate, which is a synthetic, versus cod liver oil from rositas, we got to talk about that. People need to understand there's a huge difference between these nutrients when they're in a natural food complex form, and we're losing sight of the integrity of how the body works, because we think that, well, I can get by with this retinol palmitate from whatever labs. I don't need to worry about. No, you do need to worry about it. That's the whole problem. And I think it isn't rocket science. It really isn't.
Yeah. I think this discussion would be, I completely agree. The integration of this sort of fat-soluble vitamin discussion, which, yeah, Chris is, I mean, he's brought so much insight into this space. I think it was about a year and a half ago, he really started to try to reel in the vitamin D nonsense. And he's like, really these high levels of vitamin D just aren't supported when you start, one, looking at geographically, two, looking at what cultures ate. And he started to get people to realize, all of these things work in concert. And he was the first one to bring to my knowledge some of the toxicity studies of, when they gave someone just vitamin A or just vitamin D or just vitamin K versus combinations, that those ratios completely change. And he elucidated what seemed to be, ideal ratios, and they compared, well, what foods seem to have those ideal ratios. Integrate that with some of the, mineral metabolism and some of the things that you've been, discovering with copper, magnesium, and and iron. I think that combination would be tremendous, and kind of like a state of the union of that integration. I think would be a great discussion point, and sort of deciding where do we need to go next in terms of developing labs / what should people be looking for, because I think otherwise it's just going to get confusing, and we're only going to hurt people more and more by just giving them vitamin A alone, just giving them vitamin D alone in these synthetic forms, and measuring single labs and trying to feel like we're fixing things when the body knows how to fix itself when given the proper the nutrients in the right context. So
that's the whole key. The body does know what to do, but you got to feed it right.
Yeah.
And again, it comes back to that question: what are you eating?
What are you eating?
Yeah. And what was amazing in that film for the listeners was there was some pretty weird diets. I mean, it was like, seriously, you really think that's food?
Yeah.
And, so Michael Pollan's what's the phrase he uses in his book?
It's like eat plants.
Yeah, but it's about food-like substances.
Oh, food-like substances, yeah.
It's not really food, but it looks like food. It's close. Yeah. I think that'd be a fascinating discussion, and I think it would really help the listeners get a more complete understanding of the ins and outs. And I think it would be a delight to spend the time with you guys and talk about that.
Yeah, and certainly we'll see. I'll work some magic in between when we're talking now and when this comes out, and see what I can do, because I know you have a big audience who could certainly benefit from this resource, and see what we can do to maybe give a better package with it, or enhance it, or turn this into a Facebook Live event or something. I know it's something he's done in the past, but make this a bigger discussion and give people that resource. So
yeah, put your social media juices in high gear, and we'll have
Great. Well, Morley, this has been wonderful. Again, thank you for taking the time and for continuing to push this movement forward and to forever remain curious. I really, it inspires me. Every time we talk, it just sort of ratchets up my curiosity, and much more than my cynicism. This actually doesn't make me, cynical. It really just makes me curious, and makes me want to really uncover these things. And I think that's what we really need. So thank you.
Well, I look forward to continuing the dialogue, Rob. It's been a lot of fun.
Awesome. Well, until next time, you have a good one, and keep eating real food.
Yeah, absolutely. You too.
Thank you for your presence and willingness to receive a new narrative, a passionate perspective, and perhaps a deeper sense of connection with our collective purpose. Please share this podcast with any and all that you believe will benefit from its intention to relieve one's doing and engage one's being. Please share your comments about the conversation on our podcast page and leave a review in iTunes so that the voices in this space can spread to all ears ready to receive it. Music credit goes to Dillingham for their song Vessel. Remain open, stay curious, and forever be love.
You walked on fire, and I know you tried.